I have seen the face of Khorne on the battlefield. Even the berserkers of Norsca seem like feeble children when compared to the fury of his warriors. The only fear they have is to displease their foul god by not spilling enough blood. If you're captured, it's best to fall on your blade rather than wait to see what they have in store for you. From Captain Hans Adelberg, from a Hochland long gun regiment. Champions of Khorne are varied in appearance, hailing from many different lands and cultures. They wield great swords or massive cudgels to crush their foes, and don armor that heightens their savage appearance, decorated with trophies taken from their battles. These champions are terrifying sights to behold, but all are, first and foremost, murderous warriors, and are argued to be amongst the strongest of all Chaos champions. Above all else, champions of Khorne are the greatest and most brutal fighters of Chaos. They are often blessed with strength and bloodlust beyond any normal human, and are masters of brutal melee combat. These Chaos warriors must prove themselves in battle, tithing skulls to their bloody master. They are bloodthirsty and savage fighters, reckless in their thirst for death, that lust after the spilling of blood and the roar of battle to satisfy the desires of the blood god. For all their single-minded purpose, the origins of the champions of Khorne can be just as varied as of any other race's heroes. Many of them rise from the ranks of the Kurgans, as the simple, directed lifestyle of a Khorne worshipper appeals to those bred in a culture already dependent upon constant movement, violence, and blood sacrifice. The Hung have also devotees to the blood god. Certain explorers have shown that the Norscans are less well represented, and of those, most hail from tribes in the northern and eastern extremes of the land, where the people are less civilized, and their lives are an everyday struggle against the harshest elements of nature. What they lack in numbers, however, they make up for in ferocity. The blood-crazed berserkers of the Norscans are fearsome opponents indeed, and many have been undone by their hand. Yet, bloody Khorne, as with all the Lords of Chaos, is not limited to these followers only. His grasp can reach for the heart of every soldier, every warrior, every life-taker. He is the god of war and blood and violence, and all that fight in some way subscribe to his religion. When a noble knight of Bretonnia or a righteous Templar of the Empire falls to his worship, it is because he forgets why he kills. To change from killing for the common good to killing only because he wants to, because the act pleases him, is when a righteous man has faltered from his path. These are the champions that Khorne embraces, never to release. These are the champions, the converts, that Khorne and every Chaos God particularly savor. They do not come to the worship of chaos merely because that is what is done, or what is accepted. They have rebelled against the grain. They have proved strong and brutal enough to survive the wrath of their allies. They have killed and enjoyed killing when courted their master's disapproval. And they have survived the wrath of their allies, survived the blood-soaked path to the shadowlands of their gods. They have purpose and ambition. They have a thirst that needs sating, and they are strong enough to have gone to extraordinary means to satisfy it. Khorne Champions are varied in their appearance, but most share certain qualities, if that is the right word. These murderous knights adorn their armor and war gear with trophies and gruesome objects won on the battlefield. The plate they wear is wrought in such a fashion as to lend their wearer a brutal aspect and inspire fear in all who behold them. As for weapons, their armory is almost infinite in its variety, but great swords and cudgels are favored. These war dogs do not know the subtle art of war. They use tools to spill blood and split bone. It is with fear and brutality that Khorne wins the field. Fallen knights from Bretonnia, deconsecrated Templars from the Empire, savage mercenaries from Talia, cruel bandits of the Border Princes, renegades of the Druhi, crazed dwarves from beyond the Great Skull Land. These all answer the war shriek and stand together in the cornered battle line. Next, a Chaos Champion known for his legendary bloodthirst, and also known as the Bloody Wanderer. All men of the North give praise to the dark gods of chaos. Many offer worship sufficient enough to beg some crumbs of favor from their hungry deities. A chosen few, however, seek to actively catch the notices of the ruinous powers, courting their deadly attentions in hopes of a mighty reward. Of these driven individuals, none display such single-minded devotion as the champions of Khorne. These blood-drenched murder kings seek only war, and their mighty rivalries can leave millions dead in their wake. From an anonymous source. Abrax the Bloody, known also as the Bloody Wanderer, is a Norse Chaos Lord of Khorne renowned for his legendary bloodthirst. Once a warrior of the Norscan village of Heimhall, his savage legend would begin during the terrible hardships of the legendary Blackened Winter, where the winds of chaos blew violently into Norsca, engulfing the land in roiling clouds of sorcerous corruption. During this time, the Norscans' few crops and livestock died en masse, driving the warlike tribes of the north to slaughter each other in order to control their bleak homelands' diminished resources. It was during this time that Abrax, then but a young blood, took up arms to defend his village against the ruthless barbarian invaders. His bloody exploits in the long months of battle caught the eye of the blood god Khorne, who elevated Abrax into one of his greatest champions. Guided by instinct or the dark will of his god, Abrax found himself wandering a random path to greater and greater glories, such as when he slew the Gore Prince and claimed the mighty demon blade WIKI from his dead hands. The Blackened Winter. Once a young Norse of the village of Heimdall, Abrax's descent into eternal damnation began when the Chaos Wastes began to expand, engulfing the northern lands in the deepest shadows of chaos. Though Norska is a land firmly under the control of the dark gods, and the hurricane fury of the winds of chaos is well known to it, the sheer horror of the Waste's expansion during this time was so great that the Norsemen dubbed these months the Blackened Winter. Crops and livestock withered and died in such numbers that the fractious clans of Norska were plunged into a horrific civil war in order to attain enough resources to ensure their individual survival. The menfolk of Heimdall, Abrax among them, prepared themselves to stand fast against the merciless assaults of their savage kinsmen. For hellishly long months, Abrax and his shield brothers fought a seemingly endless war in order to defend their meager wealth against the marauders. By the time the thaw had finally come, he was the last warrior standing, his mind so unhinged by the brutality he had witnessed that he could no longer keep himself from killing. Lost to the red fury of the Berserker gang, the Norseman could no longer distinguish friend from foe, and fell upon his fellow tribesmen and slaughtered his own village down to the last man, woman, and child. Khorne looked upon the slaughter from his skull throne, pleased. The Bloodfather sent down his dark blessings upon Abrax and claimed him as a new champion. From then on out, the deranged Northman struck out from the carnage of his former home to carve a red legend throughout Norska. After Heimdall, his mind shattered from the horrors he had witnessed, and his body overflowing with infernal might, Abrax wandered a random path, guided by whim or instinct, to yet greater glory. On the slopes of Splinter Rock, he faced down the Gore Prince, wresting from the Demon Lord his mighty blade, WIKI, binding it to his will and using its unholy edge to spectacularly dismember its former wielder. Upon the fire-swept steppes of oblivion, above the Howling Gorge, he fought the monstrous dragon, Shrek, striking the gargantuan head from the beast's scaly neck and claiming its mighty skull for the throne of his god. The sagas record him falling upon entire warbands with screams of hate and rage, exterminating the lesser warriors as easily as he did the villages that happened to lie in his path. Over time, Abrax, the Bloody, became famed as an avatar of Khorne himself. So completely did he embody the mindless wrath of his patron deity. an unstoppable engine of destruction, followed for glory. Wherever he strode, did the followers of the blood god flock, hoping to win the warlord's favor by pledging axe oaths to his warlike banner. Such was the champion's unholy magnetism that he was able to quickly rebuild his following after the events of the clash at the Shrine of 1,000 Eyes. The day after the battle, the Norse warrior hacked his way through the sentry picket of the far-famed Blood Wolf clan, prowling to their encampment and demanding their oaths. The savage Blood Wolves, seeing in Abrax a lord truly touched by Khorne's madness, pledged him their unquestioning allegiance, sealing their oath with the blood of their less faithful fellows in a frenzy of bloodletting before setting out into the frozen wastes alongside their new master. Pressing southwards from their Norse homeland with all haste, Abrax and his barbarians crested a craggy ridge to find a great crater where a terrible battle between other warriors of Khorne had taken place. Upon seeing Abrax in all his dark glory, the warriors ceased their combat and fell to their knees, hailing the insane Norseman as their new master with a single, deafening roar. From all across Norska had they come, fighting like demons for the chance to pledge themselves to the banner of the bloody wanderer, Abrax, chosen of Khorne. So did the warrior's horde grow to massive proportions, and he named them the Slaughtermen of Khorne. A legendary rivalry. Abrax's chief adversary was the Tzeentchian sorcerer lord Varesh Warp-Tongue, a terrifying and cunning magician leading a savage cult of devious madmen known as the Pandemoniad. The two chosen first encountered each other during Abrax's conquest of the Crimson Fields, where Varesh's sudden and spectacular destruction of the ossified spire cost Abrax victory over the rotted hosts of Fulga's Fly Lord, burying the Norscan and his blood worshippers under tons of calcified rubble. Clawing his way from the bloody avalanche, Abrax swore an oath of eternal vengeance against Varesh, swearing that he would claim the skull of the Warp-Tongue, along with that of all his followers, as Wergild for his ignominious defeat. Thus began one of the most epic rivalries in the histories of the Northlands. In the Chasm of Nightmares, Abrax and Varesh faced off in an epic battle, the every earth-shaking clash of their blades letting loose a horde of screaming phantasms whose eternal battles echo throughout the sepulchral chambers of that place to this day as a reflection of the unending hate between Abrax and his foe. At the Battle of Silver Gates, the Warp-Tongue came within a single demonic syllable of achieving immortality, only for the Red Wanderer to appear and shatter the crystalline altar powering his adversary's apotheosis, thus unleashing a horde of slavering demons from which both champions barely escaped alive. At the fall of the Slaneshi kingdom of Gratuita, the Slaughtermen and the Pandemoniad destroy the entire city, slaughtering furiously through the warband of Profligatrix, Persefuna, in an attempt to bring each other to battle. On some occasions, the Warp Tongue would, through craft and guile, inflict upon the Bloody Wanderer some stinging defeat or mortal wound, while on others, Abrax's sheer bloody-minded determination would win the day and send Varesh and his Pandemoniad fleeing in humble disarray. It was not until the Battle of the Vale of Corpses, however, that their titanic quarrel was put at last to rest. The Clash of Evil. It was at the shrine of Kamesh, nestled deep within the Strigoi kingdom, known as the Vale of Corpses, that Abrax and Varesh would settle their grudge once and for all. Varesh had been compelled to ride to the undead wastes to seek the skull of Kamesh, a mighty artifact of chaos which would usher him on the path of demonic ascension, while Abrax sought only the opportunity to bring his long-time foe to battle at last, waiting until the Pandemoniad and their allies had engaged the Strigoi armies. The wolves of Khorne charged from the northern slopes with a blood-curdling roar, promising death to all before them. Varesh Warp Tongue and the Pandemoniad channeled a mighty spell, sending torrents of howling warp flame to engulf the undead horde, including the Carrion King Urtash. While the undead horde collapsed, the Pandemoniad readied themselves to meet the furious charge of the Slaughtermen, who smashed into their lines, screaming praises to the Blood Father. Brass axes rose and fell with horrifying swiftness, sending fans of blood to paint the ruined walls of the shrine. Helmeted heads tumbled away on jets of gore as frenzied Northmen screamed unholy supplications to the Blood God, raising every severed head in praise of the Skull Throne. Suddenly, with a roar like the ending of worlds, Varesh Warp Tongue's Manticore came thundering upon the battlefield. The sorcerer had until this moment remained aloof from the battle, only investing his mighty powers where it would turn the strategic tide of the battle. But now, the time had come to take the field, for the skull of Kamesh was within sight. Entropic might filled his frame as his every ruinous blow sent armored bodies sailing through the air. Yet a familiar roar of berserker fury filled the air as a hulking, brass-armored form exploded from the ancient stone walls of the shrine, bearing down with world-ending blows upon his hated nemesis. Abrax the Bloody brought the Warp Tongue at last to a contest of champions. Abrax swung Yi Kagan upon Varesh's Manticore in a terrifying arc that severed the beast's head in a single strike. Varesh leapt from his dying steed and crossed blades with the Norskin. The sorcerer unleashed a blast of screaming warpfire, only to watch in horror as it flowed across the laughing Norseman's armor as if it were water. Khorne had blessed his champion greatly since last they met. With a trio of hammering blows, Abrax drove Varesh to his knees and struck his head from his shoulders, settling their ancient blood feud at last. Now a bit about his personality. In his mortal existence, the young warrior who would become Abrax the Bloody was a tireless defender of his people. Though dedicated to the dark gods, the young blood nonetheless was prepared to give his life in defense of his village, holding the line against his tribal enemies for months on end. Alas, the sheer brutality of the ordeal served to shatter the warrior's sanity. Lost completely to the unholy fury that dwells in the blood of his people, he became a blood-maddened slaughterer, representing his foul deity in pure microcosm. An almost elemental force of violence, Abrax was less a warlord and more a gore-drenched berserker. By his indomitable will and unmatched strength in battle, he became a chosen of undisputed renown, ruling his slaughtermen with an iron fist and brooking no challenge to his command. He was a dark warrior king of unholy martial majesty. He was driven by his hatred of Aresh Warptongue and was single-minded in his quest to revenge himself on his hated nemesis. Next, the champion who brought Sigmar Heldenhammer to his breaking point. Cormac Bloodaxe was a champion of the blood god Khorne and a fearsome chieftain and king amongst the Norse tribes. The son of the slain High King Varag Skulltaker, Cormac harbored a soul-blackening hatred towards the newly ascendant empire that had slaughtered and driven his people back to the barren Northlands. His greatest resentment was reserved for the Unberogans and their king, Sigmar Heldenhammer, who had led the charge against the northern tribes. The molten core of violence within him, as well as his favor in the eyes of the blood god, proved a potent force in unifying the scattered tribes of the Northmen. Clad in his father's chaos plate and wielding a burning axe in which was bound the spirit of a demon of Khorne, he was an avenging fury that laid waste to the enemies of his people. In time, tales of Cormac's victories and strength reached to the eastern lands, drawing the Kurgan and Hung tribes to pledge their lives to his banner. In the year 9 IC, he led the Norse wolf ships to ravage the coastal regions of the Udoses tribe, before putting the town of Hogvrik to the torch and slaying all within as a sacrifice to Khorne. Cormac then led the Norse to the Udoses capital and destroyed the castle of Zalzenhus, personally slaying Volfilla, chieftain of the Udoses, and crucifying him. The Norse armies then marched unimpeded through the outlying imperial territories, putting countless townships to the torch. When the Emperor finally marshaled the tribes to face them, his army fared no better, and was forced to retreat to the city of Middenheim. The Norse followed the battered remnants of Sigmar's army, intending to slay the Emperor and corrupt the sacred flame of Ulrich, thus destroying the faith of the Empire itself. The siege itself lasted over a dozen days. On the 13th, most terrible day of the siege, Cormac Bloodaxe, who had slain so many in battle that his axe now perpetually ran thick with congealed blood, awoke knowing the will of his god was to be carried out. For his veins throbbed, and his vision streaked with red, as though an endless gourd of blood was being poured over his head. His shaman, Khorne, had a great pit where the Norse had thrown the corpses of their enemies in honor of Khorne, and there did Cormac command the greatest warriors of 8 clans to sacrifice themselves to Khorne's glory. However, the warlord had been deceived. The shaman told Cormac his role was to fight alongside a lord of Khorne. In truth, he was to become one. Cormac's body and soul were ripped apart to serve as the host for a creature older than time and more terrible than nightmare. A bloodthirster of Khorne. It took every scrap of Khorne's power to summon such a mighty champion of the blood god, and the shaman had been forced to bind his life force to it to seal the pact. However, the results were undeniable. The runes Alaric had carved to stave off the Norsemen's sorceries disintegrated from its mere existence. Men of the Empire wept and vomited blood, and those who had only moments before been fighting like heroes of legend fled from the monstrous shadow that filled the sky with its bulk. The demon cared not for the lesser mortals fighting the Norse, and flew directly to the center of the city, to the flame of Ulrich, to Sigmar. The Norsemen roared their exultation to the cold thrones of the gods, their cries now even more hideously animalistic than those of the beast kin who stood alongside them, and they fought with fury so redoubled that none could withstand them. Such was their joy to fight under the gaze of a living avatar of Khorne the Mighty. Of the 100 men who stood with Sigmar, fully a third dropped dead from terror at the sight of the abomination that landed in their midst. Others fled in terror, leaving only a staunch few able to overcome their fear. Like the darkest desires of men and beasts knitted together in a nightmare, it was a creature of darkness dragged into the light by dreams of blood. It stood 4 times the height of a man on back-jointed legs, its body vast and muscled, sheathed in bronze and iron. Its flesh was the brutal color of charred corpses, and the stink of the grave was pressed into its wiry fur. The blunt wedge of its horned head was filled with serrated fangs, and its eyes were like holes pierced in the flank of a volcano. Enormous wings of smoking darkness spread out behind it, and flagstones shattered as its enormous weight landed. It clutched a bronze axe in one meaty fist and a writhing, whip-like cat-o'-nine tails in the other. The ends of the barbed whip's lashes ended in wailing skulls that dripped blood from their empty eye sockets. It was only through the aid of Mercer, warrior eternal of the Faustschlag, and the divine power of Ulrich himself, that Sigmar was able to marshal enough strength to defeat his foe, banishing the demon to the realm of chaos. With its defeat, the morale of the Norse army gave out, and they now fought their way past the vengeful press of Imperials to reach their wolf ships and return to their new homeland. Though the Empire was ultimately victorious, the dreadful memory of how close it had come to desolation loomed long in the memories of all who had fought and suffered in the invasion, and few would ever forget the terror of the mighty Norsemen. Cormac's flaming demon axe became a powerful artifact amongst Norscan chieftains, and would be wielded by uncounted numbers of mighty champions of the Dark Gods. Next, the Khorne Champion, known as the Slayer of Souls and the Butcher of Immortals. Before you perish, know that your death will not be meaningless. The Lord of Skulls shall feast on your heart and drink of your blood, woman, and know that in the times of darkness that will soon come to engulf the world, the gods themselves will walk the land, leading their legions in the battle to end all battles, and in those end times, great Karnath will cut down your lady, hacking her head from her shoulders, and great shall be the lamentation. Your goddess shall perish. She knows this, and now you too know the truth. From High Jarl Egil Styrbjorn to a dying priestess of the Lady of the Lake. Egil Styrbjorn of the Scalings, also known as the Slayer of Souls and the Butcher of Immortals, was a Norscan High Jarl and one of the greatest champions of the blood god Khorne to ever walk the land. The Chaos Lord attained leadership of his clan by defeating his own father in single combat, hacking his head from his shoulders and thus ensuring his passage to the blood god's halls of battle. As a result, the ancient hell-forged axes, Gumr and Gorm, became his to wield on the battlefield. Holy artifact of his forefathers, they had been passed down the line of High Jarls for generations. Under his leadership, the Scalings of Strovengard attained many glorious and bloody victories in their countless raids and battles against their rivals. The neighboring Norse tribes, such as the mighty Greylings and Wargs, the countless Kurgan horse clans, and even the slant-eyed Hung barbarians to the far east. Along the way, Styrbjorn had, as many warlords of Norska, made an alliance with the Chaos Dwarfs, specifically with the Dwarf Lord Zumara, in order to avail their craft, particularly the mighty Hell Cannon of Ereshkigal Namtar, so named for the twin demons of blood, fire, and industry bound in its creation. While Styrbjorn was wary of the excessive greed of the Dark Dwarves, the power of the demon construct proved great enough for him to tolerate the presence of the dwarves, paying them their geld of slaves and gold without rancor after every victory brought with the fury of the powerful Hell Cannon. He had become particularly impressed with the weapon's might during his war with the rival Esgar clan, as its power had reduced their mighty fortress to a flaming ruin within moments. High Jarl of the Scalings. Styrbjörn had taken many consorts from amongst the womenfolk of Strovengard, for many women of Norska are desirous to share their beds with warriors who bear the stigmata of the Dark Gods. From these countless wives did Styrbjörn sire a brood of 13 progeny of all ages. Amongst them were Hrefna and Freygerd, sword maidens of consummate skill and deadliness. Yet no one amongst his wives could give to him a son, a true warrior who could carry on the name of the warlord after his death. The hoary bearded champion was troubled by this, and long awaited a sign from the Dark Gods to reveal the woman who would be blessed with the honor to carry his true heir. It was under Styrbjörn's reign that a Bretonnian was inducted into the tribe, and this was no slave taken upon a raid, but a male child adopted and set under the guidance of the tribe's shaman, a boy who had drifted across the northern seas on a rickety fishing coracle half-dead, but with a defiant glare in his eyes, born from hate and desperation. Styrbjörn's god-touched eyes saw the power radiating from the boy, and perceived the mark of the Dark Gods upon him, for he had the ability to tap into the powers of chaos and command the winds of magic, what the Bretonnians ignorantly knew and feared as Fey-touched. Thus did Styrbjörn see the favor of his gods in taking this child as his own, and taught the child the ways of the Scalings, the ways of war, how to honor the gods with one's actions, and how to live and die with the honor befitting a man of Norska, and named him Bjarki, or Little Bear. Styrbjörn had slain tens of thousands of foes in battle, and had amply demonstrated the favor of his god Khorne by doing so. Among some of his greatest achievements was to duel a mighty dragon ogre Shaggoth atop the high knife peaks of Norska, amidst a mighty storm conjured by the Dark Gods that woke the beast, defeating the primeval horror in single combat and carving its very heart out from its chest. He alone faced a great serpent of the undersea, spearing it through its belly and dragging it ashore before cutting its head from its neck. He took leave of his clan for a time to wander the darkened roads of the Chaos Wastes and smite the numberless monstrosities there to further show his power. He had ran with the terrible Ulfarana, hunted alongside the hulking white-furred beastmen of Norska, the Ymgir, and had feasted at the tables of the terrible Bloodbeasts of Khorne. This and more, Egil Styrbjörn, wielder of the legendary demon axes Garm and Gorm, had done. For the bloodthirsty Chaos Warlord was truly the beloved of his grim god, and Khorne had lavished his favored champion with blessing upon blessing. Clad in black, impenetrable chaos plate, forged in the likeness of wolves, his long blonde beard and hair streaked with iron, a sign of an elder warmaster who had been the doom of thousands of foes. his pale eyes blazed with the fiery rage of Khorne, and his ornate chaos plate was festooned with trophies of his brutal and bloody victories. He stood as a true avatar of his god's power, and it was clear to many that he was long ahead on the path to ultimate glory and demonhood in his own right. Only a foolish hunter returns to the same hunting ground every day. A wise hunter varies his hunts so as to not hunt any of his prey flocks to extinction. From Jarl Egil Styrbjorn. Styrbjorn made preparations for a massive invasion of the far southern kingdom of Bretonnia, realm of the horsemen, when his seer, the shaman Bjarki, received a blood vision from the dark gods of the woman destined to bear Styrbjorn's demonic son. The realm of chivalry had for far too long gone unmolested by Styrbjorn and his raiders, and the mighty warlord knew at once that the gods had answered his prayers. Determined to at last ensure his legacy, he did bid his legions of battle-hardened tribesmen to take to their dragon ships that they might make war upon the horsemen once again. Styrbjorn's longships initially made landfall on the great island of Landry, off the coast of Lyonesse, located in the far northwest of the country. Though there were literally thousands of inlets that made up the archipelago of the northwestern coast, Landry was by far the most significant of these barren isles, able to support a relatively large and modestly prosperous population. It was also reputed to have been protected by the Lady of the Lake, though this was soon proved an erroneous assertion, and though it was true that the people of Landry had often paid homage to the god Manan, offering sacrifices unto him that he might guard the seas from the fury of the Chaos Raiders, whatever supplications they had made to that god proved insufficient to protect them from Styrbjorn's brutal invasion. The Norskans had made landfall upon the isle with the coming of winter, and despite the seas having roiled and heaved with fury, their fleet had emerged unscathed by the grace of the dark gods. Styrbjorn's legions, composed of bloodthirsty axemen, feral Ulfrenar, and mighty Huskarls, bedecked in hulking plate, fell upon the meager defenders of Landry and slaked their thirst for death with the blood of the innocent. Styrbjorn himself made short work of all those who dared his wrath, slaying both mere militiamen and priestesses alike with terrible ease. His raiders had closed in on the isle from both sides, thus blocking off all routes of escape from their rage. Those who could not fight thus clamoured their way to take refuge in the only place left that could afford protection, the holy abbey of the Lady, for which the isle was so famed. Though he had raided the Bretonnian coastlines many times, Styrbjorn had paid little attention to the faith of the men there. Having once sailed from the land himself, Bjarki explained the role of the Lady, describing her as a petty deity of little true power, and her clergy as doddering women who were weak of both body and mind. Striding into the chapel, beholding a statue of the Bretonnian's goddess, the warlord had felt all the more disgusted. Here, in his mind, was a weak and degenerate god, not one of power and might like the gods of the north. The dying priestess who tended the chapel spoke of how the lady would defend her people and avenge the Norskans' desecration of her holy place. But Styrbjorn scoffed at this disingenuous statement and retorted to the dying priestess the Norskan prophecy of the end times, where the dark gods who descend from their halls and lead the men of the north in the final conquest, and of how Khorne, god of war and death, would strike down the weakling deity of Bretonnia. In order to further demonstrate the weakness of the southern gods compared to those of the north, Styrbjorn personally destroyed the holy statue of the abbey depicting the weeping image of the Bretonian deity. As no divine retribution fell upon him, he had established the superiority of the northern gods. Those few amongst the people of Landry who had fought to the last were given an honourable death by the axe and the sword in honour of Khorne, Lord of Battles. Those far more numerous who had begged and bargained for life were left impaled upon great brazen stakes to die by inches, their foul cowardice robbing them the dignity of honourable death. The blackened throne of Styrbjorn was taken out from his kingship and placed within the defiled chapel, his very presence so tinged with the demonic that it further despoiled that once holy place. The Norskans made sport of those few survivors of their raid and ransacked the wealthier homes for plunder. As the roiling of the sea had delayed the rest of his longships, Styrbjorn and his warriors thus stayed at Landry, awaiting the rest of his mighty scalings to join him in despoiling the kingdom further inland. Amongst those forces were the mighty Tuskers, the hulking war mammoths of Norska. Though he had utmost faith that his warriors would easily overcome any foe, he nonetheless wished to see the terror that would grip the horsemen upon bearing witness to those magnificent monstrosities. When the rest of his longships reached Landry, he marshalled his forces further inland, intent on finding the woman prophesied to bear his promised son. The Ravaging of Lyonesse. We will slaughter them all and laugh as they beg for mercy. It will be a good day. From Jarl Egil regarding the battle with the Bretonians. Though the decision to wait at Landry for the rest of his forces to gather rankled with some elements of his followers, particularly the Chaos Dwarves, Styrbjorn silenced all dissenters in his ranks easily enough. When the rest of his forces finally arrived after 2 days, the Scalings made the push further inland. In particular, Styrbjorn was beginning to truly pursue his goal in the southern land. The seer had prophesied that the consort, revealed to be a sorcerer's witch, was even now making way north to meet with him, as the gods had decreed. They would meet on the eve of a great battle against the horsemen, where Styrbjorn would gain a great victory, and on the eve after, in sight of the demon moon Morsleep, they would conceive their child together. Concerned that the mother of his son would come to peril alone, despite Bjarki's claims of her great power, he nonetheless charged him to take a pack of horsemen southwards to the Crow Fields, where the battle with the armies of the Bretonians was to take place, and bring her to him. Meanwhile, Styrbjorn turned to plot his victory over the armies of Lyonesse. No mere mindless berserker, Egger, the Elder Warmaster, embodied the bloody, tactical mastery of his Lord Khorne, and he had plotted the downfall of his enemies since he got told the prophecy. He knew that the Bretonnians would, given the reputations of the Norskins, underestimate their foes, believing them limited only to a full frontal assault. Styrbjorn had sent a force of marauders ahead of the main horde to harry the Bretonnian forces of Duke Adalar of Lyonesse, while the rest of his warriors moved inward, slaughtering and plundering supplies. Duke Adalar met Styrbjorn's vanguard, but only succeeded into fighting them to a standstill. Skirmishes with the Norskins continued after that initial engagement, with the Northmen attempting to gauge the full strength of the Bretonnian defenders, and to hold them off while Bjarki and Kvedulf roved the western countryside, searching for the prophesied bride. Dispatched by the king himself, the forces of Longhi too marched for the defense of their southerly neighbors, despite the lingering border dispute between the two dukedoms. Bjarki soon succeeded in finding the witch, Hegtess. Pale-skinned and darkly beautiful, the sorceress had forcibly taken possession of a young Bretonnian noblewoman, supplanting her soul so that she might be able to bear the Norskins' demon son. She was brought into the Scaling War camp on the eve of the battle to come, under the baleful gaze of Morsleep. Though her eye settled hungrily upon the Scaling Warlord, their coupling had been decreed by the gods themselves, and was to take place under careful ritual, with the lifeblood of Bretonnians to baptize the product of their union. The next day, the first snows of winter had come early. Unnaturally so, some had thought. The Battle of the Four Armies. The Scalings had assembled into a wide advance, with a strong center comprised of the mighty, heavily armored Huskarls. As a predominantly infantry army, given the Norskins' general mistrust for horses in the thick of battle, it was thought that the Scalings would position themselves atop an elevated position, such as the Great Motte just behind their position. But instead, they had marched forward to engage the Bretonnians in open battle. The field was seemingly poorly chosen, a wide, flat plain with little in the way of hills, rocks, or trees to obstruct the charge of heavy cavalry. Thus, it was a theater of war that favored the Bretonnians' tactics. Duke Adalar had intended to launch a single, devastating heavy charge that would cut through into the center of the enemy horde, where Styrbjorn was thought to have dwelled, thus routing the Norscan invasion. The Pegasus Knights, however, could not deploy along with the rest of the army due to the inclement weather. It was a simple strategy on the part of Styrbjorn's adversary, Duke Adalar, but one that had nonetheless been exploited effectively by countless Bretonnian generals. The army of the Duke marched under the banner of Lyonesse, the banner of Tirulf, depicting the legendary hero and companion of the great king Gilles le Breton, standing victorious over a mountain of orc corpses, framed by a halo of holy light. It was said that the hair of an elven princess had been woven into the banner, and that any army that fought under the standard would never know defeat. 10,000 heavily armored knights charged forth, with several hundred kept behind as a tactical reserve at the barbarian ranks. The Norscans unleashed their corrupted warhounds at the charging horsemen. The unbridled fury of the mutated beasts blunted the charge, slowing the Bretonnian advance. The Norsemen too began to charge at their foes, though slowly, as though anticipating something, and overhead a crimson light thundered into the sky. Here was the herald for the first phase of the scaling battle plan. For the thundering crimson fire was the signal to unleash the blazing fury of Ereshkigal Numtar, the Hell Cannon's arcane payload of demon fire smashed into the mass of knights, even as they themselves crashed through the Norscan battle lines. Hundreds of knights were slain by the first barrage, burned and cooked alive in their own armor, flesh bursting into flame along with tabards, banners, and horse flesh, and blood boiling and bursting in veins, mingling with plate armor turned to quicksilver. The majority of knights who had survived the barrage stubbornly renewed their pursuit of the now retreating Norscans, despite the fact that it was very clear that the Norscans were attempting to draw the knights deeper into their midst. Only when they found themselves encircled by thousands of giant, black-armored chaos warriors did the knights realize that they had been duped into charging the foe's center, which had given away to them intentionally with little resistance. It had been a simple, yet excellently crafted ploy on Styrbjorn's part, and it was now clear that few Bretonnians would leave the field alive. The hammer had now fallen, and the savage fury of the Northmen saw thousands of knights and yeomen alike slaughtered and torn apart. Even with that, concealed marauders emerged violently out from under snowdrifts, roaring bestial war cries as they leapt from their concealments and fell upon knights and peasants left out on the rapidly disintegrating army's edge. The shining army of Lyonesse had been brought to its knees. The defeat of the enemy was assured now, and the Bretonnian ranks, gripped by fear, were already being torn asunder even further from within as elements of the army began to push for retreat. The inevitability of their deaths warring with their inherent pride. Nonetheless, Styrbjorn had one last malignant hand to play. For his mighty war mammoths had taken to the field, towering beasts with rage burning in their eyes. Touched by the dark gods, they smashed the ranks of Bretonnian and Norscans alike with earth-shattering force. A trio of the behemoths slaughtered hundreds of knights as Norsemen hurled axes and javelins from their howdahs, slaughtering hundreds. Styrbjorn himself sat in one of those howdahs, surveying the glorious carnage with delight. At the sight of the Norscans' monstrosities, the remaining knights quit the field in panic. With victory in hand, the eve was devoted to the enactment of the ritual to conceive Styrbjorn's demon son. 8 of the tribe's mightiest were sacrificed for the ritual, having given their lives gladly for their master's service. Under the sight of Morsleep and the dark gods, in the presence of demons and spirits who had crossed forth from the realm of chaos to bear witness, it was thus clear to Styrbjorn that his son would be favored indeed, and so he took Hectes under the sight of the witch moon, and a demon son was conceived. Hectes herself had one hand to play, however, and after Styrbjorn had taken her, she offered him a goblet, which he drained in a single draught. The cup itself held a dosage of world's root, a deadly herb known to kill men in a wasting fashion. In large quantities, it could kill outright, and Hectes had laced the warlord's goblet with enough to kill one of the immense tuskers of Styrbjorn's horde. His god-given constitution allowed him to survive long enough for Bjarki to concoct an antidote, something the Kurgan had not foreseen. Hectes had intended to birth the child alone, and then sacrifice it to the gods to attain immortality. Given how her decrepitude was beginning to consume the body she claimed to prolong her life all the more rapidly, Bjarki hurriedly brought his adoptive father back to health, and Styrbjorn awoke, burning with fury, incensed that the woman would be so brazen as to try to kill him, and worse, try to kill his son. The Kurgan had not gone far, and had not counted on the scaling shaman having the knowledge necessary to save the Chaos Lord, and had thus not managed to get far before Styrbjorn caught up with her. Shocked by his survival, the hag could barely summon her demons to aid her before his fist had sent her screaming to the ground in pain. Captured, she was taken back to the war camp, an arcane device of Khorne, a black cage edged with runes of the Dark Tongue and filled with blood, was placed upon her head to arrest her magic. The Siege of Castle Lyonesse. Having accomplished what he set out to do, Styrbjorn was ready to leave Bretonnia, though the initial decision had rankled with some of his tribesmen and allies, particularly the Chaos Dwarf Zumara, who had yet to receive his payment of slaves from amongst the captured thralls of the raid. Zumara had gone so far as to threaten to take his guild from amongst Styrbjorn's own tribe, specifically singling out his daughters. But the Chaos Lord made light of that threat, reciting an old proverb about the fury of scaling women, and would not be deterred. Any challenge to his decisions he quelled with violence. Realizing the birth of the scaling demon child would herald great devastation for Bretonnia when father and son returned to her shores, Morgana le Fey enchantress and leader of the cult of the Lady, charged one of her disciples, Anara, to prevent this from coming to pass. To this disciple, she afforded the aid and protection of the Grail Knight Reolus, a warrior reckoned by many within Bretonnia and beyond to be amongst the most elite swordsmen of the old world. The two traveled to Castle Lyonesse, where Adalar's army had fled. Joined by a contingent of knights, the Bretonnians crept into the scaling camp under the cloak of sorcery, while Styrbjorn and his warriors rejoiced and celebrated their great victory in the lands of the horsemen, the tribe's skulls regaling them with the saga of the berserker Knut the Bloody. The Bretonnians succeeded in capturing Hagtess along with the unborn child. When he realized this, Styrbjorn flew into an apocalyptic rage, his god-touched bellow carrying easily through the winding halls of the fallen Temple of Lundri, rallying the Norsemen to battle. Eyes ablaze with the fire of Khorne, Styrbjorn vented his anger upon the assailants, hacking men from crown to sternum as he frantically attempted to prevent the Bretonnians from fleeing. Ultimately, however, the warlord's prize was stolen away from him. Burning with fury, the scaling Chaos Lord swore that he would slaughter every last man, woman, and child of Bretonnia in order to save his son. Norscan longships began sailing from their rallying point on the Isle of Lundri, making beachhead upon Lyonessa's shore once again. The sight of the dreaded sails of the Scalings, combined with the utter terror the devastating defeat suffered by the Duke's army caused, led to the peasantry almost rioting in fear, frantically attempting to book passage to the island's stronghold of the Count. The Norscans sacked the townships of the Lyonesse mainland, plundering the settlements for supplies with which to carry out their coming siege, creating siege ladders, battering rams, and makeshift catapults. A barrier was formed around the island, created by lashing hundreds of longships together, while all the while hundreds more made beachhead, unloading their cargo of bloodthirsty warriors and feral chaos beasts. The first assault. When the last 1,000 made it to shore, the vast horde of her Jarl Egil Styrbjorn had finally gathered, and the champion of Khorne led them in a blood-curdling war cry. The Norscans began the siege by building a defensive emplacement far out of range of the Bretonnian trebuchets for the mighty hell cannon that had been instrumental in their prior victory. Its power would now be all the more necessary for the coming siege. The first offences were to probe and weaken the defences of the Great Citadel, the opening wave consisting of blood-maddened berserkers. Though the 1,000-strong wave was utterly defeated, they had inflicted grievous casualties upon the defenders, 90 knights and 200 peasant levies. Though Castle Lyonesse had stood unconquered for nigh 1,500 years, no man was quick to forget the bloody defeat they had suffered at Styrbjorn's hands, and some began to whisper it was better to simply give the barbarian king that which he sought. Regardless, the battle looked set to continue. The fury of Ereshkigal Namtar was once more unleashed. The demonic fire of the hell cannon lanced into the battlements of the castle, reducing the topmost towards to molten rock, sending flaming debris in all directions and killing hundreds of men-at-arms. The next barrage was just as devastating, and though Castle Lyonesse had stood undaunted against the hail of cannon fire of the Empire's war machines, not even its ancient stone could withstand the power of raging demons and dwarf craft. Realizing that the siege would end in defeat unless the enemy's artillery was neutralized, the Grail Knight Reolus led a sortie forth to destroy the cannon, which he succeeded at, banishing the demons too that had been bound to the cannon's iron and steel. Nonetheless, this was but a mere setback to the grizzled Styrbjorn, for though the Hell Cannon was no more, the Bretonnians had revealed a damning truth when their priestess parted the seas that their champion might lead his sortie. The waters of the strait were naught but 30 feet deep. As masters of the sea, this knowledge would prove devastating in the hands of the Norsemen. The Norscan offensive soon restarted, and with even greater lethality. The next wave was filled with heavily armored, blood-crazed Chaos warriors and grizzled veterans eager for the chance to die honorably in battle. The warriors smashed into the defenders on the battlements, reaping a hefty toll from the Bretonnian knights, while they were driven back. Yet another wave was all too ready to attack, affording the Bretonnians no breathing room for which to recover. The defenders were thus forced to quickly shore up their defenses, in spite of mounting casualties and weariness. Regardless, the true blow of Styrbjorn was not martial on the walls, but rather in assigning a special task to Bjarki and a cadre of warriors. Having questioned prisoners of war, the Norskans uncovered the existence of a secret route into the castle. Bjarki and his warriors made their way to the mechanism that operated the castle portcullis, slaughtering their way through the opposition they encountered on the way. A score of Sweinbjörn's dragon ships arrived, sailing the shallow strait and through the portcullis, each ship with a hull filled to bursting with bloodthirsty berserkers too long denied the glory of slaughtering their foes in the name of Khorne. And with the arrival of these warriors came the sounds of deafening trumpets, heralding the coming of the great war mammoths that had wrought such havoc on the battlefield amongst the knights of Lyonesse just 3 weeks prior. Stomping their way across the shallow strait, carrying yet more warriors in their howdahs, the mammoths would allow the invaders to bypass the walls entirely. Like living batter rams, they hammered open the mighty gates of the castle, allowing the elite of the Norscan army, Styrbjorn's mighty Huskarls, each a powerful champion of chaos in his own right, massive giants encased in unholy armor, festooned with bloody trophies and fetishes, declaring their brutal piety to charge into battle. With contemptuous ease did these warrior kings slaughter everything that stood before them, hacking through armor, flesh, and bone. However, the Huskarls eventually met their match in the Grail Knight Reolus. Many attempted to earn further glory by slaying the living saint, and all failed. With massive battle axes in hand, Styrbjorn slaughtered his foes in their scores, a bloody god of war astride the battlefield, his twin axes wailing and screaming as they hacked off limbs and heads from bodies with every swing. With every life he took, the warlord roared and bellowed, laughed and sang, reveling in the screams of the dying. the geysers of blood streaming from the severed necks, and the pleasing sound of shattering bones as he crushed their skulls and tore asunder their bodies under his axe blades. The Norsemen's assault forced the remainder Bretonnian army to retreat to the inner keep. From then on, the Norsemen started to besiege that building. In the surrounding area, the Norsemen had desecrated the sacred temple of Manan that stood on the outskirts of the island, slaughtering the knights who protected the holy place, before murdering the venerable priests and tearing down the statue of Manan in honor of their blasphemous gods, eliciting cries of outrage and sacrilege from the defenders on the battlements of the keep. Styrbjorn ordered wave after wave of men at the keep, uncaring of the mounting casualties as victory lay so close. Thousands of scalings were slain within minutes, so great was the scale of bloodshed, but it made no difference, for the Norsemen were winning, swiftly and surely. It was thus Egil Styrbjorn, a raging warlord of the Norse, an exalted champion of the blood god, whose puissance and tactical acumen had allowed him to take the legendary castle of Lyonesse, where all others before him had failed, and at such an unfathomably quick speed as well. It staggered the nobles of Lyonesse that it was a savage raider of the northern seas that had finally brought them so low. As the Norsemen began to hammer the gates apart, a wailing cry pierced the air, the birth screams of the demon child that was Styrbjorn's blood son. An excruciating sound that echoed not only in the mortal realm, but also in the madness of the realm of chaos, existing in both simultaneously. Those too attuned to the winds of magic fell to their knees in agony upon hearing the cry, and even those not gifted with the powers of magic felt their souls tremble before the scream of this unnatural birth. Only the father, Styrbjorn, was not unmanned by the sound, but rather beamed with pride and joy that the gods had at last answered his prayers. The challenge. I am Egil Styrbjorn, High Jarl of the Scalings, Slayer of Souls and Butcher of Immortals. Hear my words. The blood of 10,000 slaughtered enemies stains my blades. I have bested the nameless horrors of the northern wastes, and have walked free to speak the tale. Alone, I spared a great worm of the underseas, battling it for a day and night, before dragging it ashore and cutting its head from its neck. I have walked the smoking paths of the nightshades, and have emerged unharmed. I have strangled ice trolls with my bare hands. I have run with the Ulfarana, hunted with the Imgir, and feasted with the Bloodbeast. I have stood upon the knife peaks as the gods threw jagged bolts of lightning down upon me, and defeated one of the great dragonkin wakened by the storm, cutting its still beating heart from its chest. This and more have I done. I, Egil Styrbjorn of the Scalings. Never have I asked for quarter from an enemy, and never have I offered it, until now. Though Styrbjorn's advisors had protested his decision to parley with the Bretonnians, he had remained adamant in his decision to throw down the gauntlet before them, challenging their greatest warrior to a duel in order to decide the fate of the siege. he would not leave the life of his beloved son to chance, for who was to say that the Bretonnians would not smother him to death as the keep fell, or throw him from the battlements out of spite. It was, after all, what he would do in their position. Styrbjorn thus offered his terms. The greatest warrior amongst the Bretonnians would come forth to face him in battle. If he prevailed, the horsemen would bring out his son. If he failed, then he would be dead. In either case, he pledged the Scalings would grant the Bretonnians mercy and return to their homeland. Styrbjorn's choice had brought some murmurs of bewilderment amongst the Scalings, for many men had lost sword brothers in the battle to take the keep, and now that they were to offer the Bretonnians mercy had elicited great disapproval from many. Amongst the malcontents stepped forth the dwarf Zumara, who refused to spare the Bretonnians, as he was yet to receive his guild of slaves and gold for his services. He angrily accused Styrbjorn of being a coward and an oathbreaker, which in turn angered the prideful Norscan king greatly, and the two fought. While Styrbjorn was a true paragon of warfare, Zumara was an ancient dwarf lord who had forged his strength and skill across countless centuries, and so were evenly matched. Ensorcelled obsidian clashed with hell-forged steel as the two warriors matched their titanic strength. Though the High King was easily twice the height of the Chaos Dwarf, he was implacable as a mountain, and weathered each of the warlord's crushing blows with iron resolve. The two warriors traded a dozen blows in barely the space of a single heartbeat. Such was the fury of their battle. Styrbjorn struck his mighty armored fist into the dwarf's broad face several times, each blow strong enough to shatter stone, but still the dwarf would not fall. Zumara hammered his great axe into the Norscan side, but this likewise did not faze Styrbjorn, who held Zumara in place and rained many unforgiving blows down upon him. The Dwarf Lord threw the scaling Jarl onto the ground and charged forth, screaming to deliver his killing blow. Grasping the haft of one of his demon axes, Styrbjorn threw the mighty blade at the loping dwarf, striking him square between the eyes and killing him instantly. The king's god-touched flesh quickly knit itself back together, and he retrieved his holy weapon from the Chaos Dwarf's skull, roaring a challenge for any other who sought to dispute his rule. No man stepped forward. Styrbjorn shouted again at the battlements, WIKI serving as his translator, demanding that the Grail Knight, Reolus, whom he had briefly met during the melee in the castle courtyard, come forward. For the High Jarl judged the paladin as being able to provide him an adequate challenge. Realizing the battle was all but lost, Duke Adalar agreed to these terms, asking for an hour's time to make the arrangements. The Duel. Egil Styrbjorn stepped forward from the endless ranks of his bloodthirsty countrymen, his weathered, bearded face ritualistically painted a demonic red in honor of his god under his massive, horned battle helm. His stride was that of a man supremely confident in his ability. of a man who had slaughtered whole races single-handed and who had trod entire nations underfoot. Halfway before the keep, he bellowed his challenge, his voice reverberating with unholy power. To oppose him stepped forth the Holy Knight, Rheolus, legendary Grail Knight of Bretonnia, whose very eyes burned with fey light. In his hand, the anointed warrior held the mighty blade, Durandial, which sang with holy might. The two gods of war faced each other, but separated but a mere 20 paces. What happened next was a glorious battle, one that would live long in the songs and legends of Bretonnia, regardless of the outcome. The revered Grail Knight seemed calm and relaxed as he marched forward to meet Styrbjorn. His weapon was sheathed, and he carried no shield. When Rheolus was 40 paces from his enemy, the Norscan unhooked one of the hand axes strapped to his thighs. The Grail Knight's holy blade, Durandial, was instantly in his hands. The movement so fast that the gathered onlookers had not even seen it drawn, and Rheolus broke into a run towards the Norscan. The black armored warlord hurled the axe at his closing attacker, eliciting an angry murmur from the Bretonians. Duels were meant to be fought hand to hand, face to face. It was dishonorable and cowardly to utilize missile weapons on the field of battle, let alone in a formal challenge. The axe was hurled with incredible power, and it spun through the air and over and towards Rheolus's head. He swayed to the side as he increased the speed of his run, and the throwing axe hissed by him, missing him by scant inches. Less than 20 paces separated the two paragons of war, and the Norscan had his other throwing axe in his hand. He waited for the Grail Knight to draw closer, then hurled the missile at Rheolus with even more power than the first. The Grail Knight swatted the axe aside with his sword and sprinted towards the Norscan, his blade clenched in both hands. Then the enemy warlord drew his twin demon axes and stalked forward to meet him head-on. The two heroes clashed, Styrbjorn's unmatched, brutal strength pitted against Rheolus's sublime swordsmanship. The Bretonian's blade was a blur of silver that weaved a deadly pattern through the air as he ducked and spun, in constant motion, as he avoided the Norscan's brutal attacks. Though the Grail Knight soon succeeded in drawing first blood, this elicited no cheers from the Leonessians, who merely watched the battle impassively. The spectacle of the two champions doing battle, both displaying skill and strength far beyond normal men, was breathtaking. With the most delicate of touches, Rheolus ensured that blows that would have shorn his head clear of his shoulders and severed limbs were deflected, just missing their mark and leaving him unscathed. He deftly turned aside axe blows that, had they connected, would have hacked him in half, and his blindingly fast riposte sliced through the Norscan's armor, scoring several wounds within the first minutes of the duel, splattering the snow underfoot with the Jarl's blood. The battle took a sudden and dramatic turn when Rheolus finally bypassed Styrbjorn's defenses and impaled him with the length of his holy longsword before wrenching it into a disemboweling cut. Enraged, Styrbjorn gave Rheolus a backhand blow that sent the Grail Knight sailing backwards in the air, sending him to crash upon the hard-packed ground. Arising from the terrible blow, Rheolus turned his gaze upon his northern adversary and silently willed him to die. The Norscan was crouched on the ground in agony, blood flowing from his grisly wound, and his twin axes had dropped from limp fingers onto the ground. What happened next stole the breath of all who saw it. In defiance of Mor's rightful claim upon his soul, in defiance of his own mortality, in defiance of all sane and logical reason, the Chaos Lord dragged the great blade Durandial out of himself. The gifts of Khorne had served him well, for whatever gruesome wound the blade had dealt quickly healed, leaving Styrbjorn no worse for wear. Yet, out of respect for the fighting prowess he had shown, Styrbjorn kicked the discarded blade Durandial back to its master and allowed Rheolus to prepare himself for the next phase of their battle. The two warriors clashed once again in a furious contest of arms. Rheolus stepped around his larger opponent, every movement in perfect balance, his glowing blade flashing back and forth to turn aside the Norscan's furious attacks. For long minutes, the two battled, each straining to land a killing blow. Yet they were so closely matched that few hits found their mark at all, and none of those were fatal. Soon, the Chaos Lord and Grail Knight were spent. Styrbjorn was struck with over a dozen wounds that wept blood, and parts of his chaos armor were hanging loosely. Rheolus bled from a cut to his head, where he had suffered a glancing blow, and his armor was rent in 2 places. Still, neither warrior relented, and after no more than a few heartbeats' rest, they closed the distance separating them, grunting with effort as their blades came together. The Norscan snarled and brought one axe crashing down in a powerful blow, intending to cut Rheolus from crown to sternum. The Grail Knight whipped his sword around in a circular double-handed parry, and the axe blade slid down his sword to slam into the ice-hard ground. The Norscan's second axe wailed as it hammered around in a vicious arc, slicing towards Rheolus's hip. Rolling his wrists deftly, Rheolus continued the movement of his circular parry, and his blade flashed up, slicing cleanly through the Norscan's wrist, even as the axe screamed towards him. The Chaos Warlord's hand was completely severed, and it fell to the ground, axe still clutched in its grasp. The move had been so perfectly executed, so perfectly timed, that it took onlookers a moment to register what had just occurred. The barbarian bellowed in agony, blood pumping from the stump of his mutilated arm, but he still managed to clutch his other axe blade. With a roar, Egil Styrbjorn launched himself again at his foe, kneeing the knight in his sternum with sickening force, driving his breastplate inward and wrenching the once immaculate armor out of shape. In response, the Grail Knight swung at the scaling, his blade slashing a bloody gash across his enemy's withered face. Ducking beneath a hate-filled strike, Rheolus then slashed his blade across the barbarian's thigh, slicing through armor, flesh, and iron-hard muscle before striking bone. Continuing his assault, the holy paladin tore his sword free and lashed out once more, impaling the bleeding stump of Egil's arm. Rheolus's gleaming blade slid clear through the other side, becoming lodged. With a twist of his arm, Styrbjorn disarmed the Great Knight. Using his body's momentum, he brought his screaming demon axe, wailing in a murderous arc that hacked the Grail Knight's head from his shoulders, sending it flying through the air in a shower of blood. The men of Lyonesse let out a cry of utter shock and horror as their holy champion was felled, which was all but drawn out by the roars and adulation of the scaling hordes as they celebrated their lord and master's triumph. In turn, that sound was eclipsed as Styrbjorn raised the severed head of the Grail Knight to the heavens and roared his victory to the bloody throne of his god, Khorne, who looked down upon his favored champion with great pleasure. For a moment, plain to all who beheld him, Styrbjorn's form was superimposed with the image of a towering black demon bathed in fire and blood, with but a single hand gripping a familiar wolf-headed axe. An image of the glory that Khorne had always intended for him. With a guttural roar, the Norseman demanded his son to be brought to him. The Aftermath. I shall honor your dead champion and hold to my promise. I leave these shores, but I shall return. On that day, my son will stand at my side. Together, we shall lay waste to your lands. We shall kill every man, woman, and child that we find, and smash every last one of your stone forts to rubble. There shall be no quarter given. There shall be no bargaining for your lives. The Bretonnians honored Rheolus's pledge and delivered the demon son of Styrbjorn to his father. The child was strong, large for his age, the promise that one day he would match his father's strength and height clear to see. His eyes the same ice blue, there was little outward indication of the evil of his bloodline. Yet, nonetheless, the child's wailing screams died as he was set into his father's arms, and he looked upon the demonic face with delight. Styrbjorn beamed with pride, raising his son into the air and declaring him to his clan, who cheered at their future jarl. His advisors were now ready to press the attack, to spill the blood of the Lyonessians, and garland the throne of Khorne with their skulls. But Styrbjorn refused, for he had defeated a mighty foe this day, a champion, the equal of any man or beast that he had ever fought, and sought to honor his memory by keeping to his word. But, despite that, Styrbjorn left the Bretonnians with a warning of his return, of the destruction he and his son would one day wreak. In response, a lone knight shouted his defiance. Styrbjorn turned to face this Bretonnian noble. He had dark hair and wore a tabard of blue and red over his armor. A silver dragon was emblazoned on his chest, a symbol that the Chaos Lord regarded favorably. To the Norse, it represented power, martial strength, and passion. He saw that the warrior was young and bristled with hatred. That was an emotion Styrbjorn understood, and he knew that had the angry young knight been born of a scaling woman, he would have been blessed by great Karnath and become a mighty warrior indeed. Asking his shaman to translate the knight's words, he learned of his wrathful vow. The knight had promised that when the Norscan returned, he would be waiting. his return. I said that I would be waiting, and I am not a man who breaks his word. From Kalar of Garamond. Egil Styrbjorn would not return to Bretonnia until 50 years after the siege of Lyonesse. His half-demon son was now a mighty warrior, perhaps greater than the Chaos Lord himself. The Jarl's heir had come to face his destiny in the form of Kalar of Garamond, the betrothed of his own mother, murdered after the ritual that spawned him. As destiny dictated, these two champions were to challenge each other on the field of battle, once again deciding the outcome of a war. Styrbjorn was confident. His son radiated with demonic power. His massive cleaver was wreathed in chaotic flame, and his eyes were filled with fury and destruction. The gods themselves were watching. Kalar, however, was no longer the young knight of the realm Styrbjorn had eyed years before. As the Bretonnian prayed, his eyes blazing with a fey light, the old Jarl realized that his patron goddess was also watching. The Grail Knight approached Styrbjorn's son, his own blade wreathed in a pale flame, and with thunder overhead, the two champions of the gods came together. And so ends Egil Styrbjorn's tale. Sadly, the end of it is forever lost to the annals of history. And now, onto his war gear. Styrbjorn is amongst the deadliest warriors in all the world, having defeated countless mighty foes, including a dragon ogre Shaggoth and, most recently, a favoured Grail Knight of Bretonnia. The Jarl's naturally prodigious strength is further augmented by an unnatural constitution, as the blessings of his god have made him capable of shrugging off even the most terrible of blows with ease. First on the list, Gorm and Gorm. The axes of the High Jarl are ancient, hell-forged weapons, heavy with infernal magics, their blades shaped in the likeness of wolf heads. A gleaming blood-red ruby is inset into the hafts, representing the eyes of the great wolves, and they blaze with inner fire. These gems burn with unholy power, as the axes taste the blood of his enemies, wailing and screaming with delight as they kill. Named in honor of the great wolves that accompany Karnath on his bloody hunts across the heavens, the axes were holy artifacts of the Scalings, handed down through the generations. The mighty weapons are capable of splitting fully armored men in two from crown to sternum, and in Styrbjorn's hands can deliver truly mighty blows. And the Chaos Plate, forged of blackened steel and adorned with grisly trophies and foul emblems, the Chaos armor of Egil Styrbjorn is forged to bear the likeness of howling wolves. The very shoulder plates themselves are forged in the visage of snarling, tusked wolves, which heightens the armor's ferocious appearance. All enclosing, the armor is spiked and segmented, particularly around the gauntlets, which lends great lethality to Styrbjorn's unharmed blows. And with that, we now have 500 newly enlightened souls, and so the mission to enlighten the world has come that much closer to being achieved, thanks to you. Now, next up, the near immortal, demonic Lord of Khorne, known as Bloodwrath. Scar Bloodwrath, demonic lord of Khorne, is a mighty, near immortal Chaos Champion of Khorne. Scar began killing in Khorne's name from the moment he was strong enough to heft an axe, swiftly garnering a reputation of a bloodthirsty butcher of the worst kind. While still a mere whelp in the eyes of his fellow Scudamour, he slew their tribe's chieftain in a brutal display of violence. Though this was far from the first skull that Scar had claimed for Khorne, it was the one that drew the vast and terrible eye of the Blood God. Stood over the corpse of a rival twice his size, Scar roared in agony as the rune of Khorne branded itself upon his beating heart. Though the tribes of Scudamour did not deign to challenge the weak peoples of the south, Scar found no shortage of foes to battle in Khorne's honor. The Chaos Waste rang to the sound of Scar's war cries, and as the years passed, so his legend grew. He cut down Ungolor of the Tahmaks with insulting ease. He hacked the heads from the great spawn Whitlich before hurling the abomination from atop Bloodfire Falls. It was Scar who fought for 20 years amid the demon-thick morass of the Blood Marshes, and he who felled the Keeper of Secrets, Chithnis, below the Infinite Arch. Unstoppable though he was, none could fight with such raging abandon without eventually being slain. Yet death proved not to be the end for this champion of Khorne. Scar met his first death in the lair of the sorcerer Vidas the Lair. Scar slew every one of the Tzeentchian mage's 999 worshippers, only to be sliced in half by Vidas's crystal blade. Yet Khorne judged the blow a cowardly one, struck from behind a veil of sorcerous illusion. Thus, the Blood God breathed fresh life into his champion that day. Scar's mortal form burned away to nothing, only to be reborn from the pooled blood of Vidas's followers. He surged up from the bloody lake, huge demon axes on brass chains clutched in his white-knuckled fists. Hurling his new weapons across the shadow chamber, Scar sunk both blades deep into Vidas's unnatural flesh. Dragged with horrible inevitability into Scar's embrace, Vidas the Liar pleaded and squirmed. By way of response, Scar tore his foe's throat out with his teeth. Glittering blood sprayed a wide arc before Khorne's champion ripped one axe free and lopped the sorcerer's head from his shoulders. Scar Bloodwrath has died many times since that day, but always Khorne has brought his champion back to life through the spilled blood of his foes. In return, Scar reaps such a tally of skulls that none can keep count. He is one of Khorne's most favored, savage to the point of madness, devoted to nothing but slaughter in the name of his merciless deity. In battle, his chain-linked demon axes whirl about him in a hurricane of blood and death. Those who follow him must keep pace with his murderlust, or else fall by the wayside, their skulls, in turn, offered up for the glory of Khorne. One by one, they are all cut down. Eventually only the gore-soaked Scar remains to gather new followers and lead them to war once more. Incessant resurrection has its price, however. With each bloody rebirth, Scar has lost a little more of himself, his grasp upon reality slipping with each step upon the road to demonhood. These days, Scar needs no sustenance save combat. He does not sleep, and the fire in his veins is such that he could never rest, even should he wish to. His fury is endless, his hunger for battle a constant clamor that drowns out all consideration of strategy or caution. So lost to Khorne's rage has Scar become that none, save Archaon the Ever-Chosen, can command him. Even then, he only bends the knee at Khorne's behest, his form trembling every moment with a barely suppressed need to kill. To Archaon, Scar is nothing but a blunt instrument, a living weapon to be wielded unto destruction. Scar, lost amid a red haze of bloodlust, could not care less. Khorne demands slaughter like never before, and Scar Bloodwrath will deliver it gladly. Next, a great hero of the great war against chaos, known as the Bloodied One. They know you are here. Without me, you will be destroyed. I have no regrets, and I expect no mercy, and you will receive none. From Thorgar, before slaying the traitor Pseudobal. Thorgar the Bloodied One, also known as Thorgar of the Khazags and Hroth, was a mighty demon prince of Khorne. Thorgar fought in the armies of the ever-chosen Asavar Kul during the Great War against Chaos, having been but a minor Chaos champion among many others at the time. Yet nonetheless, he was a bloodthirsty warrior who tirelessly sought the favor of his gods and harbored lofty dreams of immortality. When his warband's champion died during the Battle of Kislev, Thorgar took his place and led the battered survivors away from the vengeful armies of Magnus following Kul's defeat. Thorgar spent the immediate aftermath of the war in raiding in the World's Edge Mountains, glutting himself on plunder. Eventually, he drew the eyes of the Chaos Gods and was sought out by their herald, the Kurgan sorcerer Pseudobal. Pseudobal commanded him to rebuild an army from the survivors of Asavar Kul's horde, as well as from among those Norskans and Kurgan who refused to surrender following the Ever-Chosen's defeat, and follow the setting sun to a Chaos Shrine hidden in the Northeastern Empire, where he would prove his worth before his demonic patrons. Gathering the Norse and Kurgan locked in battle with the Empire's forces amidst the crags and defiles of the World's Edge Mountains, Thorgar amassed a potent raiding party and struck out to despoil the imperial province of Ostermark. Thorgar, by chance, happened upon the hidden war camp of a Norscan chieftain known as Engric Wolfbane, and was heartened by the presence of his kinsmen who still continued the fight against the Empire. Seeing the favor of the gods with this wandering warrior, Engric and his warband joined with Thorgar to raid the outlying townships of Ostermark. At one such township, he fought the Chaos Champion of Khorne, known as Crag Bloodwound, who contested the sacrifice of its inhabitants in his own name. After slaying Crag in single combat, Thorgar took command over his Chaos Knights. The champion then led his warband to plunder a Sigmarite temple, recovering the artifacts of the Chaos Gods that had been taken by the Imperials after the Great War. Sudobal re-emerged during this time, warning the Northmen of a mighty army of Talabakland that had arisen to dash the hopes of the followers of the true gods. Having never known an enemy he would not face with joy, Thorgar led his warband to reinforce his fellow Northmen at the fortress of Heldenborg, which had been claimed by the followers of Chaos after the defeat of Kuhl's horde. At Heldenborg, Thorgar and his Northmen held off the Imperial army, claiming yet another victory for the glory of Chaos. His numbers swelled by Norskans and Kurgan, Thorgar continued westwards according to Sudobal's instructions. Before reaching the shrine, he defeated a challenge from an enigmatic Nurglite warlord known only as the Fly Lord of Nurgle, whose warband fled in humble disarray when the undivided warrior struck down the Nurglite Plague Champion in single combat, much as he had with Crag Bloodwound. With all obstacles overcome and a sizable horde at his back, Thorgar sought his destiny at the shrine of the Chaos Gods. Here, Sudobal revealed his spirit form before the Northmen, and spoke cryptically of how Thorgar would now have to prove his worth to the Chaos Gods by overcoming the trials of the caves alone. Thorgar eagerly stepped within the bowels of the shrine, proclaiming that he would not fail his gods, and that his name would become legendary as that of their greatest champion. With his mighty oath spoken, the Northman threw himself against the trials with vicious abandon, cutting his way through hordes of demonic spiders to reach a pestilent chamber where a horde of Nurglite plague bearers awaited him. After a brutal contest, where his axe bit deep into countless ranks of demonic flesh, Thorgar at last passed the trial, his wounds restored by the feculent restoration of the Plague Father. From the mounds of desiccated flesh, he recovered a magnificent axe. Sudobal hailed the weapon as Foebane, a demon weapon forged anew from the shards of Asavar Kul's own axe. Having proven his worth as a warrior, Thorgar's next trial was as a leader of men, and so he led a phantom army of Northmen to do battle with the legions of Khorne, he and his otherworldly marauders shedding the blood of bloodletters in sacrament to the Lord of Slaughter. Having overcome the raging demons of Khorne, he was now forced to battle against Wordspawn. After dispatching the hulking aberrations, Thorgar claimed the Armor of Damnation, a set of phantom chaos plate that was nearly impenetrable to mortal weapons, With magical blade and otherworldly armor, he proclaimed himself invincible, and was suddenly spirited to the furthest chamber of the cave, where his final and most terrifying challenge awaited him. All who tread upon the path of chaos must wrestle with their own selves, their hopes, their greed, their fear, and their anger, which threatens to overcome them at every turn. To prove his resilience and worthiness to follow the path to its final conclusion, the gods bade Thorgar to face a terrible test, to fight his own self in single combat. Aghast at the prospect, but still steeling his northern courage against such a foe, he launched himself into furious combat with his doppelganger. With the axe, foe-bane, carving terrible blows in the phantom Thorgar, and his own plate deflecting the furious blows of his enemy, the Bloodied One finally emerged from the terrible battle, battered but still alive. From his own bloody corpse, he claimed the fabled Ring of Change, a terrible artifact that allowed its wearer to wield the mutating powers of the Chaos Gods, the very power of change itself, the essence of chaos. With all the trials concluded, the unbowed Thorgar found that there was but one final test to complete before the next stage of his destiny could be completed. In the final, cavernous antechamber of the shrine lay two massive runes dedicated to the Chaos Gods. One carved in the likeness of the rune of the fly, the symbol of Nurgle, and the other, the skull rune of Khorne, Lord of Battles. Here, Thorgar heard the voices of the Chaos Gods themselves, or perhaps their heralds, and chose to pledge his soul in dark service as one of their number's exalted champion. Upon doing so, Thorgar's armor and body were reforged in the favored image of his new master, and he swore he would do all within his power to bring his new patron glory. His master then spoke to him, commanding him to find the body of Asavar Kul and take up the Kurgan warlord's mantle as their great servant. For at the moment of Kul's demise, the gods intervened to protect his body and imbued it with their power in the hopes that a successor might one day rise to take his place. Yet, as this was done, the meddling High Elves, knowing that the power entrapped in Kul's corpse could spell untold devastation upon the mortal world, intervened and hid the champion's corpse with spells so intricate that even the all-seeing eyes of the Chaos Gods were thwarted. Emerging from the caves with his body and armor bearing the marks of his new allegiance, Thorgar learned from Sudobal that it was a mage of Safari who cast the final enchantment. Once the elf mage was found and the knowledge torn from his dying lips, the Blooded One would hold knowledge that even the gods did not. Bellowing a call to his lieutenant, the Norscan berserker known as Olaf, who rejoiced to see that his chieftain yet lived, Thorgar proclaimed that the feeble High Elves would weep bitter tears in memory of the day he became their foe, and bade that his proud warriors ready for war and a journey towards the Sea of Claws. The hunt for the mage. mage. Sudobal then instructed him to locate an elven mage who knew the location of the corpse of Warlord Cool. During this time, he allied with Kaskit, a Skaven warlock engineer of Clan Skra. Having angered the Skaven Council, Kaskit quickly accepted the alliance in order to receive Thorgar's protection, and agreed to help him locate the mage. As he grew in power, Thorgar ended up killing Sudobal for turning against him. Shortly afterwards, having communed with the immortal spirit of Asavar Kul, he was elevated to demonhood. In his new, resplendent form, Thorgar fought and slew the great Dragon Prince of Kalador, Kalanos, before laying waste to the Elf Lord's army. He then marched upon the army of Talabakland as they flew towards the city of Talabheim. Cornered in the burning square of a ruined Talabek village, Count Feuerbach challenged Thorgar to single combat. Though he fought bravely, wielding one of the legendary runefangs, the Elector Count ultimately fell before the might of the Demon Prince. With their leader dead at his hands, Thorgar marched upon the walls of Talabheim, seeking to claim it in the name of Khorne. Fortunately for the city's defenders, reinforcements had arrived in the form of Count Stefan von Kessel of Ostermark and his elven allies, led by the mage princess Aurelian. At the height of the battle, Stefan, mounted atop a noble griffon, engaged Thorgar in an epic duel. Eventually, the Demon Prince was able to cast down the young Elector's mount, even as the warrior's runefang pierced his unholy flesh. However, as the Demon Prince prepared to kill Stefan, he was suddenly engulfed in a blast of magical flame. Aurelian could not harm the Demon Prince, but she was able to distract him. With his attention turned towards the elf, the cannon batteries of Talabheim unleashed a payload of destruction upon Thorgar, banishing him to the realm of chaos. With their leader destroyed, the Northmen hordes soon broke and fled. Talabheim was saved. And now, his war gear and abilities. As a mortal warrior, Thorgar was a truly ferocious fighter, having bested several other Chaos champions in single combat, and earning the patronage of one of the Dark Gods. As a Demon Prince, his might was increased yet further, allowing him to slaughter both a fabled Dragon Prince of Kalador and his monstrous steed. First up, Uzul, Slayer of Kings. The Slayer of Kings was gifted to Thorgar by none other than Asavar Kul himself. It was a huge sword with the raging soul of a captive greater demon, Uzul, bound within it. Alas, it was lost when Thorgar was defeated at the siege of Talabheim. This very sword would later be rediscovered by the future ever-chosen Archaon. Then, the Armor of Damnation. This highly ornate suit of chaos armor shimmered with unnatural energies that distorted the position of the wearer so that an enemy's blows missed their mark. And the Ring of Change. Filled with the warping power of chaos, the Ring of Change could transform an attacker into a slavering chaos spawn. Next, there is actually one more Khorne Champion to cover, and this one is perhaps the greatest of the blood gods chosen, known as the Bloodbeast, the Talon of Khorne, Skylar Anfingrim. Skylar Anfingrim, known also as the Scourgeborn, the Talon of Khorne, and the Bloodbeast, was once a mighty and far-famed champion of Khorne, perhaps the greatest of the blood gods chosen. In his former life, he was nigh invincible and unmatched in battle, having slain some of the fiercest beasts and armies in service to the Norscan god of war. The terror of coastlines from frozen Norsca to exotic Ind, Skylar's name was synonymous with victory and pillage. No other had climbed the ranks of the blood god's esteem more quickly than him, and many amongst his tribe, the vicious warriors of the Iron Pelt, had boldly claimed that it would not be long until their chieftain was visited by Khorne with the greatest gift of demonhood. In a sense, they were right. It was when Skylar had single-handedly slaughtered the bestial gorges of Undermountain, only the latest in a long litany of mighty and unimaginably violent deeds, that his god, Khorne, granted him a final boon. But so passionate was Skylar for the gifts of the blood god, that this mutation, in addition to the multitudes he already possessed, proved too much for his mortal form, and his transformation into a chaos spawn was complete. But Khorne had not abandoned him, not truly, for the raider had pleased him so that he made certain that Skylar's new form was far, far more deadly than anything he had hunted and slain in his path to glory. Indeed, so great a champion was Skylar in life that he still retains the favor of Khorne in his new state. Amongst the warriors of Khorne, Skylar's name is still spoken in hushed whispers of awe, for no man has laid more skulls at the foot of Khorne's throne than he. The Saga of the Bloodbeast. It was in the age when the Greylings were ruled by Jarl Grundval Fangskar, in the waning summers after he had slain his uncle, the usurper Björn Berok, that a terrible curse had fallen upon the Bay of Blades in the chaos-touched land of Norsca. No longships made to port, the Greyling raiders, ever the scourge of the weak lands of the south, did not return with the frost winds of winter as they had in the many generations the tribe had dwelt beneath Stoneclaw Mountain. No ships laden with gold, sacrifices and plunder to sate the tribe through winter had come out from the cool mists. As fear began to grip the Greylings, they cried out to their dark gods for deliverance. Grundval sent ships to investigate, to learn of what became of the raiders, but only one marauder out of the half-dozen ships dispatched returned. Shivering and near dead from 1,000 wounds, the marauder spoke of what had transpired. A great beast of the deeps, or perhaps many, such was the ferocity of the monster encountered, that had smashed aside the ships of the Greylings. Now the tribe knew why their chosen and marauders had not returned from the summer raids. Grundval, knowing this to be a curse from the gods, called upon the powers of chaos he had been gifted with to defeat the beast. But, to no avail. Thus he commanded his shaman, Uthras, to employ the oldest and most powerful rites to call upon the gods. The shaman went out into the tundra, his great white beard soaked in the blood of 13 of the finest grayling virgins, and his lungs swollen with the smoke of ogre bone and ghost root. In the demon-haunted mist, it is said that he spoke with Khorne himself and heard his will. Ulthras returned with the word of the blood god, and indeed, something more. Khorne had demanded a champion, a mortal man with the raw strength and savage heart to slay such a beast. And to that fell end, the demon slayers of the wolf-headed god offered a token, an obsidian tusk on a barbed silver chain, forged in the fires of Khorne's rage, and cooled in the bloody seas beneath the skull throne. It would be bestowed upon any man great enough to slay the fell Leviathan, who would then know the favor of Khorne himself forevermore. Grunwald sent ravens in all directions, bearing with them the decree of Khorne. In time, champions of the blood god arrived from all over Norska, and some even came from the Kurgan lands, all eager to answer the call of the blood wolf. They had all boasted of how they would deliver the Greylings from their peril and earn the favor of Khorne. But none who sailed out into the mists to fight the Leviathan returned. Finally, salvation came in the form of Skylar Unfingrim, son of Turek, warlord of the Iron-Pelt tribe, who were kinsmen to the Greylings and champion of Khorne. Though he had not yet seen 25 winters, his name and his sword were known throughout the north. Indeed, word of Khorne's commandment had come late to him, for he was abroad that summer raiding and despoiling the undead lands of far-off Khemri. It was said that his attacks were so swift and so fierce that the mere sight of his sails struck fear into ghastly hearts of the undead rulers of that ghastly kingdom. When he was told of the perils awaiting him, Skylar is said to have laughed out loud and boasted that as he put the fear of death into those without souls, no power short of that of the gods themselves could ever make him feel fear. Confidently, he took the only ship in Grunwald's harbor, a rickety old sloop, and sailed out into the Bay of Blades to do battle with the Leviathan. It has long been a source of high praise amongst the Norse to call a raider so fierce that he was unafraid of leading his brothers into the underworld. But Skylar was unafraid of sailing into the underworld by himself. For several days, he scoured the seas until he stole a glimpse of the beast. So it was a scaly tentacle shot out from beneath the waves that struck out against Skylar. He cut it to bloody ribbons with his greatsword, but then another tentacle arose, then a second, then a third, and then more than he could count as they wrapped around his boat in a stranglehold. Skylar leapt from every piece of flotsam and jetsam and tore into the beast, turning the waters of the bay black with its blood. But the Kraken was truly touched by the gods, and weathered the champion's every sword stroke. Eventually, Skylar took up a hook attached to a great chain, and threw it at the beast. By the favor of the gods, Skylar had managed to lodge his hook between the chitinous plates of the Kraken's hide. The beast submerged itself under the cold waters, and he followed him this time, letting it drag him through the frosty brine all night. In time, the beast rewarded his iron stamina and took refuge in a cove. And it was there Skylar beheld the monster in all its glory, and saw in its great black eyes the remnants of a man. The spawn then led Skylar to a shadowy cave at the edge of the sea before it left its haunt to prowl the bay again. This time, Skylar let the beast go and hid himself in the monster's nest of bones and human detritus. As cunning as he was deadly, the champion waited for the monster to return and come to rest, and it was then he impaled it from below, piercing its foul heart and letting its foul, black blood wash over him. The next day, Skylar returned to the Greyling's meat hall, his plate armor caked in the Leviathan's gore, and carrying a bone pike spear with the creature's eye impaled upon it as proof of the deed. All the tribesmen in the hall roared Skylar's name, and Ulfras draped the black tusk pendant over his mighty shoulders. From that day forth, he walked in the highest echelons of Khorne's favor. The Path of Glory. Skylar continued his quest for the favor of the Blood God, leading his tribesmen to victory after victory in bloody battles. The slaying of the Kraken of the Bay of Blades could not sate his thirst for battle, and he sought out more fearsome beasts that he could tear out their hearts and place them upon Khorne's table. He heard tales of a monstrous Jabba slave, the most ancient and foulest creature of the beast kin, that plagued the river Foltag in the lands of the Acelings in the far northeast. Boldly, Skylar entered the mist-clad banks of the river and brought the hulking monstrosity to battle, striking it down and taking its mammoth skull for Khorne's throne, thus gaining the respect of the merciless, blood-worshipping Acelings. Skylar's longships ranged far south and west in search of battle, raiding the Empire, Britonia, and even further afield. Every autumn, his ships returned to port, the hulls filled to bursting with captured treasure, plunder, and captives to be sacrificed to Khorne. The people of his tribe grew strong and proud with such a great leader overseeing them, and it was often said among the Iron Pelt that Khorne would soon give Skylar the dark apotheosis, and that he would soon be risen to rule alongside the Lord of War in glory. Skylar and Fingrim then took part in an even more audacious attack, such as the great raid he undertook upon the Skaven city of Black Gulch. Skylar charged into the holding of the Rat Men and made it so that the whole winding chasm ran red with their blood. Looking down upon this bloody feat with great pleasure, Khorne saw fit to gift Skylar with even greater strength. Skylar found his limbs swollen with muscle, hulking and ape-like, and ending in long claws. Honoring Khorne for his blessing, Skylar launched a raid against the Arabians on the great war dows of Plenipotentati Ibn Dul and personally reduced the flagship of the Duli Armada to splinters. This time, Skylar's bravery was rewarded with a serpentine tail ending in a snapping maw. His savagery could not be contained. So eager was he for the blessings of Khorne, and so immersed was he in his faith that he even struck out against fellow servants of chaos. When the Chaos Dwarves of the Great Skull Land came north to create trading channels with his tribe, as they had done with many of the tribes of Norsca, offering their master-crafted armor and weapons in return for slaves and other commodities, Skylar is said to have taken up his blade and butchered the entire delegation, including their bodyguard. Khorne was mightily pleased with this and bestowed a new boon upon his champion. Now, his body was covered in a profusion horn-like plates that could turn aside the strongest steel, whatever its make. In 2298 IC, while again off raiding the Empire, Skylar was brought to battle by a vengeful army of farmers, displaced and dispossessed by his earlier invasions. Mere children before the might of a favored chosen of Khorne, he easily slaughtered the entire army single-handed, but left its leaders alive, nailing their bodies to the prows of his longships as grotesque trophies of his victory. It was when he carried out the massacre of the grotesque gorges of the Undermountain, slaying each and every one of those hulking aberrations, that Khorne gave his champion his last boon. But this newest mutation was too much for even the mighty Skylar to endure, and his body flowed and spasmed out of control, and the strain of the mutations twisted his mind to that of a ravenous, murderous beast. Skylar Anfingrim, mighty chosen champion of Khorne, was now little more than a berserking chaos spawn. Talon of Khorne. But Khorne had not abandoned Skylar, not entirely, for the Blood God had seen to it that his new body was even more deadly than his old form, and indeed, Skylar, unlike any other spawn of chaos, still retains the favor of his patron. Indeed, he remains as high in Khorne's favor as he ever was, a testament to his strength in life. But no longer was he the great warlord of the Iron Pelt. That honor went to his lieutenant, the fearsome champion One-Eyed Urlock. His warband did not turn Skylar out, however. Indeed, there were many amongst them who were in awe of his new form and venerated him as a living god, an avatar of Khorne's fury. Urlock placed around Skylar's wolfish head the collar of Khorne, a symbol of Khorne's favor, which granted Skylar immunity to coward's magic. When Urlock led the warband into battle, he unleashed Skylar's unmatched fury into the enemy lines, directing the horrific, demonic monstrosity as if it was some tamed attack beast. When Urlock and his fellow Norsemen marched in the great army of Azavar Kul, they too fought like many other warbands at the titanic battle at the gates of Kislev, when the army of Kul was slaughtered by the vengeance of Magnus the Pious. Many thought that Skylar had fallen as well, But this was not the case, for Khorne had protected the fallen champion, as the oceans of blood he spilled daily in his glory was pleasing to the blood god. The monstrous raider now prowls the Chaos Wastes, seeking only to kill, maim, and slaughter in the name of his god. Though he stands high in Khorne's favor, Skylar Anfingrim's fate is naught but a life of unending slaughter, and eventually a bloody end in battle that will please his unholy god. And now, a quick overview of his powers. Skylar Anfingrim is a chaos spawn of Khorne, but he is the mightiest and most powerful of those fearsome beasts. His favor in the eyes of Khorne elevating him to a level of power beyond most other creatures of chaos, as rewarded for his valorous service in life. The Talon of Khorne possesses incredible strength, as befits any child of Khorne, and also great resilience to attacks of magical nature, due to the brass collar of Khorne gifted unto him by Ulfras during his adventures. Those who seek to undo him from afar with the arcane must instead gather their courage and face him in close quarters. A suicidal task, for Skylar strikes not only swifter than other spawn, but also harder and deadlier. Such is the favor of Skylar that the eyes of the gods are still drawn to his exploits in battle as he slays the mightiest warriors of the enemy. His bravery may lead to the gods seeing fit to grant him a boon, making him all the more deadly. Though his mind was rent asunder upon his transformation, the beast that was Skylar Anfingrim yet retains of the great warrior he once was, in order to lead men into battle, loping before the massed ranks of the warband, venerated as a living god. The warriors of chaos interpret Skylar's frenzied roars and guttural battle cries as orders and directions in battle. Next, the ultimate recut, and then the Prince of Pleasure himself, Khorne's greatest rival, the Dark Prince of Chaos.